When my husband walked out after 45 years of marriage, I thought my world had ended. But when I discovered who he left me for, I made a decision that destroyed his perfect little fantasy. I'm grateful you're here to hear my story. Stay until the end and comment what country you're watching from so I can see how far this has reached. My name is Dorothy Brennan, and at 70 years old, I never imagined I'd be telling this story. But here I am, sitting in the sunroom of the house I've called home for 4 decades, finally ready to share what happened when my entire world came crashing down around me. They say that after a certain age, you've seen everything life has to offer. You've weathered storms, celebrated triumphs, buried loved ones, and welcomed new generations into the world. You think you've experienced every shade of joy and sorrow that existence can provide. I used to believe that too. I was wrong. At 70, I thought I knew exactly what my life would look like for whatever years remained. Quiet mornings with my husband Walter over coffee and the newspaper, gardening in the afternoons, weekly dinners with our son Trevor, maybe some travel, visiting places we'd always talked about but never quite gotten around to seeing. A peaceful, predictable slide into our golden years together. Walter and I had built something I thought was unshakable. 45 years of marriage, nearly half a century of shared memories, inside jokes, weathered hardships, and accumulated history. We'd raised a son together, built successful careers, created a home filled with love and laughter. Or at least, that's what I believed. Our story began in Millbrook Falls, a picturesque town in upstate New York where the autumn leaves turn the hillsides into paintings and winter snow blankets everything in pristine white. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where the same families have lived for generations, where your reputation matters and your word is your bond. I was 25 when I met Walter Brennan at a hospital fundraiser. He was 27, freshly established in his orthodontics practice, and devastatingly handsome in that clean-cut, all-American way that made mothers approve and daughters swoon. His smile could light up a room, which I suppose made sense given his profession. He specialized in creating perfect smiles for others, and his own was absolutely magnetic. I was working as a nurse at Millbrook General Hospital, having just completed my degree 2 years earlier. I loved my work, loved the feeling of making a difference in people's lives during their most vulnerable moments. But I'd also grown up in an era where women were expected to eventually settle down, start families, and support their husbands' careers. It was just what you did. Walter pursued me with a determination that felt flattering at the time. Flowers delivered to the nurse's station, love notes tucked into my coat pockets, surprise picnics by the lake on my days off. He was romantic and attentive in ways that made all my friends jealous. Within 6 months, he'd proposed. Within a year, we were married in a beautiful ceremony at St. Catherine's Church with half of Millbrook Falls in attendance. The early years were good. Walter's practice flourished, and his reputation as the best orthodontist in 3 counties brought in a steady stream of patients. We bought a beautiful Victorian home on Sycamore Lane, with a wraparound porch and enough bedrooms to fill with the children we planned to have. Trevor came along 3 years into our marriage, and I had never felt love like I did the moment they placed that tiny, perfect baby in my arms. Walter seemed equally smitten, hovering over us both with protective devotion, talking about all the things he'd teach his son, all the adventures they'd have together. When Trevor was 6 months old, Walter sat me down for a serious conversation. His practice was expanding, he explained. He needed to bring on associates, invest in new equipment, maybe even open a second location. It was a huge opportunity, but it would require financial risk and countless hours of his time and attention. "I need you to quit nursing," he said, holding my hands across our kitchen table. "Just for a while, just until we get the business stable. Trevor needs you at home, and I need to know you're managing everything here so I can focus on building our future." I'd hesitated. Nursing wasn't just a job to me. It was a calling, a part of my identity. But Walter painted such a compelling picture of our future, of the financial security he could provide, of the life we could build for our son. And in 1978, it wasn't unusual for wives to sacrifice their careers for their husband's ambitions. It was just what you did. So I quit. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd go back once Trevor was in school, once Walter's practice was established. But temporary has a way of becoming permanent when you're not paying attention. The years slipped by like water through my fingers. Trevor grew from a baby to a toddler to a bright, energetic little boy who filled our home with laughter and chaos. Walter's practice expanded exactly as he had predicted, then expanded again and again. The money rolled in, more than I'd ever imagined we'd have. We moved from our Victorian starter home to a sprawling estate on 15 acres just outside town. Walter bought luxury cars, joined the country club, started golfing with judges and state senators. I decorated our new house, hosted dinner parties for Walter's colleagues and important clients, volunteered with the hospital auxiliary, and devoted myself to raising Trevor. When Trevor was 12, I mentioned going back to nursing. My license was still active, and Millbrook General was always short-staffed. Walter had looked at me with genuine confusion. "Why would you want to do that?" he asked. "We don't need the money, Dorothy, and I need you available for the practice events, the social obligations. You're so good at that stuff, at making connections and keeping everyone happy. That's valuable too."
So I stayed home. I told myself I was contributing to our success in other ways, that being Walter's wife was its own form of work, that supporting his dreams was just as important as pursuing my own. Trevor grew into a handsome, ambitious young man who idolized his father. He followed Walter's footsteps into orthodontics, attending the same dental school, doing his residency at the same hospital where Walter had trained. Walter couldn't have been prouder. 5 years ago, when Trevor was 40, Walter helped him open his own practice across town in the newer, wealthier suburb of Ashford Heights. Walter co-signed the business loans, introduced Trevor to all his professional contacts, and basically handed his son a thriving patient base on a silver platter. I watched it all happen with a mother's pride, never questioning the dynamic that had developed in our family. Walter and Trevor, the successful orthodontists, the men of achievement and importance, and me, Dorothy, the supportive wife and mother who made everything run smoothly in the background. Looking back now, I can see how I'd slowly disappeared into that role, how Dorothy the nurse with dreams and ambitions had gradually faded away, replaced by Mrs. Brennan, Walter's wife, Trevor's mother, the woman who hosted perfect dinner parties and always knew the right thing to say to the right people. But I'd been content with that identity, or at least I'd convinced myself I was content. After all, I had a beautiful home, financial security, a grown son who was successful and happy. What more could a woman my age want? Everything changed 6 months ago, on a Monday morning in late September, when the leaves were just beginning to turn and the air carried that first crisp hint of autumn. I'd been up since 6, as always, making coffee and preparing breakfast. Walter usually left for the office by 7:30, seeing his first patient at 8. Our morning routine had been the same for decades, comfortable and predictable in the way long marriages become. But that morning, Walter didn't come down in his usual work clothes. Instead, he appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing casual slacks and a polo shirt, carrying a large duffel bag that I recognized from our last vacation to Martha's Vineyard. "Walter?" I looked up from the eggs I was scrambling, confused. "Don't you have appointments this morning?" He set the bag down by the kitchen door with a heavy thud that seemed to echo through our suddenly too quiet house. The sound triggered something in my chest, a tightening sensation that I didn't yet understand, but that my body somehow recognized as danger. He canceled them, he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Dorothy, we need to talk." Those 4 words. In 45 years of marriage, I'd learned that "we need to talk" never preceded good news. But nothing could have prepared me for what came next. I turned off the stove, my hands already starting to shake, though I didn't yet know why. "What's going on? Is something wrong?" Walter pulled out a chair at our kitchen table and sat down heavily, like a man steeling himself for an unpleasant task. He gestured for me to sit across from him, and I did, my heart hammering against my ribs with increasing urgency. "I'm leaving," he said, the words coming out in a rush, like he'd been rehearsing them and wanted to get through the speech before he lost his nerve. "I'm fallen in love with someone else, and I can't keep living this lie anymore." The kitchen seemed to tilt sideways. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles going white, trying to anchor myself to something solid as the foundation of my entire existence crumbled beneath me. "What?" The word came out as barely a whisper. "Walter, what are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm leaving you, Dorothy. I'm in love with someone else, and I want a divorce." The bluntness of it was staggering. After 45 years, he was ending our marriage with the same casual tone he might use to order lunch. "I don't understand," I said, my voice shaking. "Who? How long has this been going on?" For the first time since this conversation started, Walter looked at me directly, and what I saw in his eyes made my blood run cold. There was no guilt, no remorse, no anguish over what he was doing. If anything, he looked impatient, annoyed that I was making this difficult. "Does it really matter?" he asked. "The point is, I'm not happy anymore. I haven't been happy for a long time, and I've met someone who makes me feel alive again, who reminds me that I'm not just some old man waiting to die." "Of course it matters." My voice was rising now, shock giving way to desperate confusion. "Walter, we've been married for 45 years. You can't just walk away from that without even trying to work things out." He sighed, running his hand through his silver hair in a gesture I'd seen 1,000 times before. "There's nothing to work out, Dorothy. I've made my decision. I'm moving out today, and my lawyer will contact you about the divorce proceedings." "Your lawyer?" I repeated the words numbly. "You've already hired a lawyer. How long have you been planning this?" "A few months," he admitted. "I wanted to make sure everything was in order before I told you." A few months. While I'd been planning our 45th anniversary celebration, researching romantic restaurants, and thinking about renewing our vows, my husband had been consulting with divorce lawyers and plotting his exit strategy. "Who is she?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. "Do I know her?" Walter's expression shifted slightly, and I recognized the look. It was the same defensive pride he got when showing off a new car or talking about a particularly lucrative month at the practice. He was proud of this woman, whoever she was, proud to have won her affection. "Her name is Crystal Summers. She's 32 years old, she works as a pharmaceutical sales rep, and she makes me feel things I haven't felt in decades."
32 years old. The words hit me like a physical blow. Walter was 73. This woman was 41 years younger than him. She was younger than our son. "Walter," I said, my voice breaking, "she's young enough to be your granddaughter. Can't you see how inappropriate this is?" His face hardened instantly, that defensive pride morphing into cold anger. "That's exactly the kind of judgmental attitude I can't live with anymore, Dorothy. You've become so rigid, so closed-minded. Crystal doesn't see age. She sees the man I am. She appreciates me in ways you stopped appreciating me years ago. I've never stopped appreciating you, I protested, tears now streaming down my face unchecked. Walter, I've devoted my entire adult life to you, to our marriage, to building this life together. How can you say I don't appreciate you? You appreciate the lifestyle I've provided, he corrected coldly. The house, the cars, the social status. But you don't appreciate me. You don't make me feel desired or exciting or vital. You just make me feel old. The cruelty of the accusation took my breath away. I had given up my career for this man. I had sublimated every dream and ambition I had ever had to support his success. I had raised his son, hosted his parties, played the role of the perfect wife for 45 years. And now he was telling me it wasn't enough because I didn't make him feel young? What about Trevor? I asked, grasping for anything that might penetrate the cold determination I saw in his eyes. What about our son? Have you thought about what this will do to him? Something flickered across Walter's face, but it was gone too quickly for me to identify. Trevor knows, he said. I told him 2 weeks ago. He understands. The room spun. Trevor knows? Our son knows you're leaving me and he hasn't said anything? I asked him not to. I wanted to be the one to tell you. And, Dorothy, Trevor supports my decision. He wants me to be happy. Each word was like a knife finding a new place to cut. It wasn't just losing my husband, it was realizing that my son, the child I devoted my life to raising, had known his father was planning to abandon me and had said nothing, had chosen his father's happiness over my devastation. I don't believe you, I whispered, but even as I said it, I knew it was true. I could feel the truth of it in my bones, in the way certain recent conversations with Trevor suddenly made terrible sense. The questions about whether Dad seemed happy lately, the gentle suggestions that maybe I should think about what I wanted to do with my life going forward, the careful distance he'd been maintaining for the past few weeks. He'd known. Trevor had known, and he'd been preparing himself, protecting himself, making sure he'd be okay when his father finally dropped this bomb on his mother. Walter stood up, picking up his duffel bag. I've taken what I need for now. I'll send for the rest of my things later this week. My lawyer is Lawrence Penderton from Pemberton and Associates. He'll be in touch about the financial arrangements. Financial arrangements, I echoed hollowly. You're really doing this? You're really walking on our marriage like it meant nothing? It meant something, Walter said, and for the first time I heard a hint of something almost like regret in his voice. It meant 45 years of my life. But Dorothy, I'm 73 years old. I probably have, 10 or 15 good years left if I'm lucky? I don't want to spend them feeling dead inside. I want to feel alive. I want passion and excitement and joy. And I can't find those things anymore. He walked to the door, then paused with his hand on the knob. You'll be fine, Dorothy. The house is paid off, you have the investments from your parents' estate, and I'll make sure you're taken care of financially. But I can't stay in this marriage anymore. I won't. And then he left. Just like that. 45 years of marriage reduced to a Monday morning conversation in our kitchen while the eggs I'd been cooking grew cold on the stove. I sat at that table for hours after he left, watching the sunlight move across the floor, listening to the house settle and creak around me. Our home had never felt so empty, so cavernous, so devoid of life and warmth. When I finally moved, it was only because my body demanded it, bladder insisting, stomach growling, despite my complete lack of appetite. I wandered through the rooms of our house like a ghost, seeing everything through new eyes. The living room where we'd hosted hundreds of dinner parties, where I'd played the perfect hostess while Walter networked and charmed. The den where Walter had spent countless evenings watching sports or reading medical journals while I sat quietly, knitting or reading, content just to be in the same room. The master bedroom where we'd slept side by side for 4 decades, where our intimacy had gradually declined from passion to routine to occasional obligation to finally nothing at all. How long had it been since Walter had touched me with genuine desire? How long since we'd had a real conversation about anything beyond schedules and social obligations? How long had I been living with a stranger wearing my husband's face? The questions circled my mind like vultures, but I had no answers. Or rather, I had answers I didn't want to face. The truth was that somewhere along the way, probably years ago, our marriage had become a business arrangement. Walter provided money and status. I provided social grace and domestic management. We were partners in the enterprise of maintaining the Brennan family image, but we hadn't been truly married, truly connected, in longer than I wanted to admit. But I'd been content with that arrangement. I thought we both were. Apparently, I'd been wrong. The phone rang around 3 in the afternoon, jarring me out of my numb stupor. I stared at it for several rings before answering, somehow knowing exactly who it would be.
Mom? Trevor's voice came through the line, careful and measured in a way that immediately made me angry. Dad called me. He said he talked to you this morning. Talk to me, I repeated, my voice flat with shock and fury. Is that what he called it? Your father left me, Trevor. He walked out on 45 years of marriage for a woman younger than you are. There was a pause. When Trevor spoke again, his tone was even more carefully controlled. I know this must be really hard for you, Mom, but you need to understand that Dad's been unhappy for a long time. Unhappy? The word tasted bitter on my tongue. And you knew about this? He said he told you 2 weeks ago. Yes, Trevor admitted. He asked me not to say anything until he'd talked to you. He wanted to handle it in his own way. His own way, I echoed, which was to ambush me on a Monday morning and walk out with a duffel bag? How considerate of him. Mom, please try to understand. Dad's getting older, and he's worried about wasting whatever time he has left. If Crystal makes him happy, shouldn't we want that for him? The mention of her name hit me like a slap. Crystal? You've met her? Another pause, this one longer and more telling. Yes, Dad introduced us about a month ago. He wanted my approval before he went forward with this. I sank down onto the couch, my legs suddenly unable to support me. Your approval? Your father needed your approval to leave his wife of 45 years for a woman 41 years younger than him? It's not like that. Then what is it like, Trevor? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like my husband and my son conspired behind my back to destroy my life. That's not fair, Trevor protested, finally showing some emotion beyond careful neutrality. We were trying to protect you. Dad wanted to make sure everything was handled properly before telling you. Protect me? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Trevor, your father walked out on me this morning. I've spent the entire day sitting in this house feeling like my whole life was a lie. But sure, tell me how you were protecting me. Mom, I know you're upset right now, but you need to try to be rational about this. Dad's moving on with his life, and we all need to accept that. Getting angry and bitter isn't going to help anyone. There was something in his tone, something beyond just trying to calm an emotional mother. Something that sent a chill down my spine. Trevor, I said slowly, what aren't you telling me? Nothing, Mom. I just want everyone to get through this without making things more difficult than they need to be. Dad's willing to be generous in the divorce settlement if you don't fight him on this. Generous? I repeated. My father cheats on me, abandons our marriage for a woman younger than his granddaughter, and he's willing to be generous if I don't make a fuss about it? It's not cheating if he's asking for a divorce, Trevor said, and I could hear him retreating back into that careful, neutral tone. Look, Mom, I have to go. I have patients this afternoon, but I'll call you later this week, okay? We can talk more when you've had time to process everything. He hung up before I could respond,
leaving me staring at the phone in my hand, trying to understand how I'd ended up here. How had my son, the baby I'd raised and loved and sacrificed everything for, become someone who could dismiss my devastation so casually? Who could tell me to be rational about my husband leaving me for someone younger than our child? The days that followed blurred together in a haze of shock and grief. I barely ate, couldn't sleep, wandered through the house at all hours talking to myself like a madwoman. I kept expecting Walter to come back, to say he'd made a terrible mistake, that he'd been having some kind of crisis but had come to his senses. But he didn't come back. Instead, a courier arrived 5 days after he left with an envelope from Pemberton and Associates containing preliminary divorce papers that reduced our 45-year marriage to a series of cold, legal paragraphs about asset division and spousal support. I sat at my kitchen table, spreading the papers out before me, trying to make sense of the legalese. Walter was proposing what his lawyer called a fair and equitable division of marital assets. I would keep the house and my own inherited money from my parents. He would keep his practice, his retirement accounts, and various other investments that had been in his name alone. The spousal support he was offering seemed generous at first glance, a monthly amount that would certainly cover my expenses. But as I looked more carefully at the numbers, I realized what he was actually doing. He was buying his freedom, offering me enough money that I wouldn't fight the divorce, wouldn't make waves, wouldn't do anything to complicate his new life with Crystal Summers. I was about to set the papers aside, too numb and exhausted to think about them anymore, when something caught my eye. A section titled Pre-Existing Agreements that listed simply, None Applicable. And that's when I remembered the prenuptial agreement. It had been 45 years ago, so long that I'd honestly forgotten about it. But it came rushing back now with crystal clarity. Walter's parents, concerned about protecting his son's eventual inheritance and the orthodontics practice they'd helped him establish, had insisted we signed a prenup before the wedding. I'd been hurt at the time, viewing it as a lack of trust, a suggestion that our marriage might fail. But Walter had convinced me it was just a formality, something to make his parents happy, something we'd never actually need because we were going to be together forever. The prenup had been specific, and I recalled now with growing clarity, quite one-sided. It protected Walter's assets and his practice, but it also contained a clause that I had barely paid attention to at the time, a clause about infidelity.
Walter's mother had insisted on including it, I remembered now. She'd been a shrewd woman who'd grown up wealthy and understood how to protect family money. If either party was found to have committed adultery, the innocent spouse was entitled to 75% of all marital assets. At 25 years old, madly in love and convinced my marriage would last forever, I'd signed without really thinking about what it meant. Why would I need protection against Walter's infidelity when we were so clearly perfect for each other? Now, at 70 years old, sitting in my kitchen with divorce papers that made no mention of that prenup, I understood something important. Walter had forgotten about it. In 45 years, he'd completely forgotten about the legal document that could destroy his plans to walk away with most of his wealth intact. Or maybe his lawyer had forgotten to search for it. Maybe in today's world where prenups were common and computerized records made everything easy to track, an agreement signed 45 years ago in a small-town lawyer's office had simply slipped through the cracks. I stood up slowly, my mind suddenly clear for the first time since Walter had walked out. I walked to the den where we kept our important documents, pulling open the drawer of the filing cabinet where I'd meticulously organized 4 decades worth of paperwork. And there, in a folder labeled Legal Documents, Marriage, I found it. Our prenuptial agreement, yellowed with age, but perfectly preserved, with both our signatures at the bottom alongside those of 2 witnesses and a notary public. I read through it carefully, my hands trembling slightly. Yes, there it was. The infidelity clause, clear and unambiguous. If either party engaged in an extramarital affair, the innocent spouse was entitled to 75% of all marital assets, including business interests, real estate, investments, and retirement accounts. Walter had been having an affair with Crystal for at least 8 months, according to what he told me.
He'd fallen in love with someone else while still married to me, had been seeing her regularly, building a relationship with her while still sharing a home with his wife. That was adultery. Clear, unambiguous adultery. And thanks to the prenuptial agreement that Walter had apparently forgotten existed, it was going to cost him everything he'd spent 45 years building. I sat there in the den, holding that piece of paper, feeling something stirring inside me that I hadn't felt in days. Not grief, not shock, not despair. Determination. Walter thought he could walk away from our marriage with his wealth and his dignity intact, leaving me with just enough money to be comfortable, but not enough to be truly independent. He thought he could abandon me for a woman younger than our son and face no real consequences beyond writing me a monthly support check. He was wrong. I picked up my phone and started searching for divorce lawyers in Millbrook Falls. Not just any lawyer, but the best one I could find. Someone who would understand the value of what I just discovered and know how to use it. Because Walter was about to learn a very expensive lesson about the importance of reading the fine print, and about the danger of underestimating the woman he'd spent 45 years taking for granted. The game had changed, but Walter just didn't know it yet. I didn't sleep at all that night. How could I? The prenuptial agreement sat on my nightstand like a loaded weapon, its yellowed pages containing the power to completely upend Walter's carefully constructed exit strategy. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind raced with possibilities, with scenarios, and with the delicious justice of what was about to unfold. But beneath the determination and the growing sense of righteous anger, there was still grief. Still the raw, aching wound of losing a marriage I'd believed in for 45 years. Still the bewildering pain of realizing that the man I'd built my entire adult life around had stopped loving me somewhere along the way, and I'd been too blind, too complacent, or too afraid to notice. When dawn finally broke over Millbrook Falls, painting my bedroom in shades of pink and gold, I got out of bed with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years, maybe decades. I showered, dressed in one of my nicer outfits, a navy blue pantsuit that I usually reserve for charity luncheons, and spent extra time on my makeup and hair. If I was going into battle, I was going to look like a woman who had her life together, not a devastated wife falling apart at the seams. By 8 o'clock, I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of Millbrook Falls' most prestigious law firm, Henderson & Clark, waiting for them to open. I'd done my research the night before, scrolling through legal websites and reviews until my eyes burned. Victoria Henderson was reported the best divorce attorney in the county, a woman who'd built her reputation on protecting wrong spouses and ensuring they got every penny they deserved. The firm occupied the entire third floor of the Riverside building downtown, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the falls that gave our town its name. When the receptionist finally unlocked the doors at 8:30, I was the first person through them. "I need to speak with Victoria Henderson," I told the young woman at the desk, a pretty brunette who couldn't have been more than 25. She gave me a sympathetic smile that suggested she'd seen plenty of women like me walk through these doors. "Do you have an appointment, Mrs. Brennan? Dorothy Brennan? And no, I don't have an appointment, but I'm willing to wait as long as necessary. What I have to discuss with Ms. Henderson can't wait another day." Something in my tone must have convinced her this wasn't a standard case. She picked up her phone, spoke quietly to someone, then looked back at me with surprise. "Ms. Henderson can see you in 20 minutes. Would you like some coffee while you wait?" Those 20 minutes felt like 20 hours. I sat in the elegant waiting room, surrounded by leather furniture and expensive art, watching other clients come and go. A harried-looking man in a business suit who barely glanced up from his phone. An elderly couple who sat holding hands, both looking sad but resigned. A woman about my age who kept dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, her mascara running in black streaks down her cheeks. Was that what I looked like? Is that who I'd become? Just another heartbroken wife joining the ranks of the divorced and discarded? "Mrs. Brennan?" A tall woman in her mid-50s appeared in the doorway, her silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in an elegant chignon, her tailored charcoal suit projecting competence and authority. "I'm Victoria Henderson. Please come with me." I followed her down a hallway lined with legal books and framed certifications into a corner office that commanded a spectacular view of both the falls and downtown Millbrook Falls. Victoria gestured to a comfortable chair across from her massive mahogany desk and settled into her own seat with practiced grace. "Now then," she said, folding her hands on the desk and giving me her complete attention, My assistant said this was urgent. Tell me what's happening. And so I did. The whole story came pouring out, from Walter walking out 6 days ago to discovering he'd been having an affair with a woman 41 years younger than him, to my son's betrayal and complicity, to the divorce papers that had arrived yesterday. Victoria listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a legal pad, her expression remaining professionally neutral. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and studied me for a long moment. Mrs. Brennan, I'm very sorry you're going through this, but I have to be honest with you. What your husband is proposing in terms of settlement, while perhaps not as generous as you might deserve after 45 years of marriage, is actually fairly standard for situations like this. The house, your inherited assets, and reasonable spousal support. Most judges would consider that adequate. Even though he's leaving me for someone young enough to be his granddaughter? I asked, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. Unfortunately, yes, Victoria said with genuine sympathy. Morally reprehensible behavior isn't necessarily relevant in a no-fault divorce state, unless there are specific legal protections in place. She trailed off, clearly trying to let me down gently, to prepare me for the reality that Walter was probably going to get away with this. Like a prenuptial agreement? I asked quietly. Victoria's expression sharpened with interest. Do you have a prenuptial agreement? I reached into my purse and pulled out the carefully folded document, placing it on her desk. We signed this 45 years ago. Walter's mother insisted on it. I honestly forgot it existed until I was looking through the divorce papers last night and saw that his lawyer listed no pre-existing agreements. Victoria picked up the document with the careful reverence of someone who understood its potential value. She read through it slowly, her eyes widening slightly as she reached the relevant section. When she looked up at me again, there was something new in her expression. Not pity or sympathy, but the gleam of a hunter who'd just spotted exceptional prey. Mrs. Brennan, she said slowly, are you absolutely certain that your husband engaged in an extramarital affair while you were still married? He told me himself that he'd been seeing Crystal Summers for 8 months before he left me. He said he'd fallen in love with her and couldn't keep living a lie. And you have witnesses to this admission? I thought about it. No, we were alone when he told me, but he introduced her to our son Trevor a month ago, and Trevor admitted that Walter told him about the affair 2 weeks before he left me. Trevor would have to confirm the timeline. Victoria was already pulling out fresh legal pads, her pen moving rapidly across the page. This changes everything, Mrs. Brennan. According to this prenuptial agreement, if either party engaged in adultery, the innocent spouse is entitled to 75% of all marital assets. That would include his orthodontics practice, all real estate held jointly, investment accounts, retirement funds, everything. Can he claim that practice isn't a marital asset since he had it before we married? I asked, remembering something I'd read online during my sleepless night. Normally, yes, Victoria said. Premarital assets are typically protected, but this prenuptial agreement specifically states that if either party engaged in adultery, the other is entitled to more than half of the assets. Your husband's mother was a very thorough woman. She made sure that if either of you strayed, the consequences would be severe. The irony wasn't lost on me. Walter's own mother, trying to protect him from a potentially unfaithful wife, had inadvertently created the weapon that would be used against her son decades later. So what happens now? I asked, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. Victoria leaned forward, her expression intense. Now we need to build an airtight case. We need documentation of the affair, testimony from witnesses who can confirm the timeline, evidence that he was romantically involved with Crystal Summers while still legally married to you, phone records, credit card statements, anything that shows he was supporting 2 households or spending money on her while you were still together. I have access to our joint credit card statements, I said. Walter never bothered to remove me from those accounts. He probably assumed I wouldn't look at them. Perfect, Victoria said, making more notes. We'll need copies of everything from the past 8 months. Every restaurant charge, every hotel reservation, every suspicious expenditure. We'll also need to take your son's deposition, get his testimony about when his father told him about the affair, and whether he met Crystal before your husband left you. The thought of forcing Trevor to testify against his father made my stomach clench. But then I remembered his cold dismissal on the phone, his casual suggestion that I should just accept Walter's betrayal and move on. My son had chosen his side. Now he'd have to live with the consequences of that choice. "There's something else you should know," I said. "Walter told me his lawyer is Lawrence Pemberton from Pemberton and Associates. Is that going to be a problem?" Victoria's smile was sharp as a blade. "Lawrence Pemberton is very good at what he does, but he's also notoriously arrogant. He probably did a standard asset search and missed this prenup because it's so old. By the time he realizes his mistake, we'll already have him cornered." She stood up, extending her hand. "Mrs. Brennan, I'd be honored to represent you in this case, and I promise you, your husband is going to deeply regret underestimating you." I shook her hand, feeling something shift inside me. I wasn't just a heartbroken wife anymore. I was a woman with power, with options, with the ability to fight back against the man who'd thrown away our marriage like it meant nothing. "When do we start?" I asked. "Right now," Victoria said. "I'm going to file a response to the divorce petition today, and we're going to request a preliminary hearing to discuss the prenuptial agreement. Your husband and his lawyer are going to get a very unpleasant surprise." I left Victoria's office 2 hours later with a clear plan of action and a retainer agreement that would have seemed impossibly expensive a week ago. But money didn't matter anymore. What mattered was justice. What mattered was making sure Walter understood that 45 years of marriage couldn't be erased with a duffel bag and a younger woman's phone number. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity. I spent hours going through our joint credit card statements, highlighting every suspicious charge. Dinner for two at Antonio's, the most romantic restaurant in Ashford Heights, on a Tuesday evening when Walter had told me he was at a dental conference. A weekend stay at the Riverside Inn, an expensive boutique hotel 2 towns over during a period when he'd supposedly been golfing with colleagues. Jewelry purchases from Tiffany's, perfume from Saks Fifth Avenue, lingerie from an upscale boutique I'd never shopped at. Each discovery was like a small knife to my heart, not because I still loved Walter. I was beginning to realize that what I felt for him wasn't love so much as habit and dependence, but because each charge represented a lie, a moment when he'd looked me in the eye and deceived me with casual ease. Walter had gotten sloppy, arrogant in his belief that I was too trusting or too stupid to notice what he was doing. He used our joint accounts to fund his affair, leaving a paper trail that would destroy him in court. But the worst discovery came when I was going through Walter's home office, looking for any additional documentation that might be useful. In the back of his desk drawer, hidden beneath a stack of old dental journals, I found a folder labeled Crystal. Inside were love letters. Dozens of them, printed out emails that Walter had apparently been too sentimental to delete. I sat at his desk, reading through them with a sick fascination, watching my husband's affair unfold in nauseating detail. "My darling Crystal," one began, dated 6 months ago. "Last night was magical. Every moment with you reminds me of what passion feels like, what it means to truly connect with someone who sees the real me. Dorothy has been a good wife in her way, but she doesn't understand me like you do. She doesn't make me feel alive." I was a good wife in my way? The casual dismissal of 45 years of devotion, of sacrifice, of love, reduced to a single condescending phrase? Another letter from 3 months ago. "I can't wait to start our life together properly. Just a few more months of keeping up appearances, of playing the dutiful husband, and then we'll be free. I'm working with Lawrence to make sure the divorce is clean and quick. Dorothy will be fine. She has the house and enough money to be comfortable. She'll probably be relieved to be rid of me anyway." The arrogance of it was breathtaking. Walter had convinced himself that I'd be grateful for the scraps he was willing to throw me, that I would simply accept my discarding with quiet dignity. But the letter that made my blood run truly cold was dated just 2 weeks ago, written days after Walter had told Trevor about the affair, but before he'd told me. "My love, everything is falling into place. Trevor has agreed to help smooth things over with the business arrangements. He's going to bring some of my higher value patients over to his practice before I file for the divorce, so Dorothy can claim no interest in future earnings. He's also agreed to store some of my valuable equipment at his office, just temporarily, so it won't show up in the asset division. My boy understands that I deserve to start this new chapter of my life without being financially crippled by a vindictive ex-wife. I read that paragraph 3 times, making sure I understood what I was seeing. Walter and Trevor had conspired together to hide assets from me. They'd actively worked to fraud me, to ensure that when the divorce went through, Walter would walk away with far more than he was legally entitled to. My son hadn't just sided with his father, he'd actively participated in stealing from his own mother.
I photographed every letter with my phone, my hands shaking with a combination of rage and heartbreak. Then I carefully replaced everything exactly as I'd found it. Walter had no idea I'd been in his office, no idea I'd discovered his plans. Let him think he was getting away with it. Let them both think they were so clever, so much smarter than the foolish woman they'd spent years taking for granted. That afternoon, I forwarded all the photographs to Victoria, along with the highlighted credit card statements and a detailed timeline of Walter's affair based on the evidence I'd gathered. Her response came within an hour. This is beyond what I'd hoped for. The letters alone prove adultery, but the conspiracy to hide assets with your son's help? That's fraud. We have grounds not just to enforce the prenup, but potentially to pursue criminal charges if we wanted to push it that far. Your husband is going to wish he'd been honest with you. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday, just 2 weeks after Walter had walked out. Victoria had requested an emergency session, arguing that there was evidence of ongoing asset concealment that required immediate judicial intervention. Walter still had no idea what was coming. His lawyer had responded to Victoria's filing with dismissive confidence, basically suggesting that any prenuptial agreement from 45 years ago was likely outdated and unenforceable. They clearly hadn't actually read the document yet, hadn't realized how ironclad its language was. The night before the hearing, my phone rang. Trevor's name appeared on the screen, and I stared at it for a long moment before answering. "Mom," his voice came through, and I was struck by how much he sounded like his father. That same careful tone, that same controlled emotion. "I heard you hired Victoria Henderson. That seems like an aggressive move for what should be a straightforward divorce." "Does it?" I kept my voice neutral, giving nothing away. "I thought I should have legal representation, given that your father is ending our marriage." "Of course you should have representation," Trevor said quickly. "But Victoria Henderson? Mom, she's known for being ruthless, for dragging cases out and making things as difficult as possible. I thought you'd want to handle this civilly, for everyone's sake." "Everyone's sake?" I repeated. "You mean your father's sake? Making sure he can walk away from 45 years of marriage without any real consequences?" There was a pause. "Mom, I understand you're hurt, but fighting this isn't going to change anything. Dad's made his decision. Making this ugly isn't going to win him back. It's just going to make everyone miserable and cost a fortune in legal fees." "Is that what you think I want?" I asked, my voice hardening. "To win your father back?" "Isn't it?" Trevor shot back. "Mom, you have to face reality. Dad doesn't want to be married to you anymore. He hasn't been happy for years. Fighting him on this isn't going to change that fact." "You're right," I said quietly. "Fighting him won't change the fact that he's been unfaithful, that he's leaving me for someone younger than to be his granddaughter, that he spent months lying to my face while planning his exit strategy. But it might change how much of his money he gets to keep when he starts his wonderful new life." Trevor's voice took on an edge I'd never heard before. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means your father isn't the only one who can hire a good lawyer, Trevor. It means I'm not just going to roll over and accept whatever scraps he's willing to throw me. It means there are consequences for betrayal." "This is exactly what I was afraid of," he said, his tone shifting to something colder, harder. "You're going to make this about revenge, instead of just accepting reality and moving on with your life." "Moving on with my life?" I echoed. "The way you moved on by helping your father hide assets from me?
The way you conspired with him to transfer patients and equipment to your practice so I couldn't claim any interest in them? The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. When Trevor finally spoke again, his voice was tight with barely controlled anger. Who told you about that? Does it matter? I asked. The point is, I know. I know that you and your father have been working together to defraud me. I know that you've been helping him steal from your own mother. It's not stealing, Trevor shot back defensively. Those patients were Dad's relationships, built over decades. Why should you get a piece of that just because your marriage didn't work out? Because I spent 45 years supporting his practice, I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. Because I gave up my own career to raise you and manage his household so he could focus on building that practice. Because under the law, I'm entitled to a fair share of the marital assets we built together. A fair share, Trevor scoffed. Mom, you're getting the house, your inheritance, and enough monthly support to live comfortably for the rest of your life. What more do you want? I want what I'm legally entitled to, I said, and I want you and your father to understand that I'm not just some disposable convenience you can just discard when someone younger and more exciting comes along. This is insane, Trevor said, his voice getting louder. You're really going to destroy our family over money? I didn't destroy our family, Trevor. Your father did that when he decided to have an affair. You helped destroy it when you chose to side with him instead of having any loyalty to your own mother. Loyalty? Trevor's laugh was bitter. Mom, I'm supposed to be loyal to you while you try to financially destroy my father? While you hire the most vicious lawyer in town to drag him through the mud? I hired a competent lawyer to protect my interests, I corrected. If that makes you uncomfortable, maybe you should think about why you're so worried about your father's finances being examined in court. Because it's going to cost him everything, Trevor exploded. Because you're going to take a successful practice that he spent his entire career building and tear it apart out of spite. No, Trevor, I said quietly. I'm going to enforce a legal agreement that your father signed 45 years ago, an agreement that he seems to have forgotten about in his rush to start a new life with his mistress. That's not spite. That's justice. What agreement? Trevor's voice had changed, uncertainty creeping in. What are you talking about? Ask your father. Better yet, ask him if he remembers the prenuptial agreement his mother insisted we sign before we got married. Ask him if he remembers the clause about adultery. I could hear Trevor's breathing quicken on the other end of the line. What clause? The one that says if either of us engaged in an affair, the innocent party gets 75% of all marital assets, including his practice, his retirement accounts, his investments, everything. The silence stretched out so long, I thought Trevor might have hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. You're bluffing. Am I? Why don't you ask your father's lawyer? I'm sure Lawrence Pemberton will be very interested to read the prenup he somehow missed in his asset search. We have a preliminary hearing tomorrow at 10. You're welcome to attend if you'd like to watch your father's careful plans fall apart. Mom, please. Trevor's voice had shifted again, desperation replacing anger. Don't do this. We can work something out, something fair to everyone. You don't need to use some 45-year-old document to punish Dad for being honest about his feelings. Honest? The word came out as a laugh. Trevor, your father lied to me for 8 months. He used our joint credit cards to take his mistress to expensive dinners and buy her jewelry. He conspired with you to hide assets from me. The one thing he hasn't been is honest. Okay, yes, he made mistakes, Trevor admitted. But Mom, if you enforce that prenup, you'll destroy him. The practice is everything to him. Taking 75% would leave him with almost nothing. He should have thought about that before he decided to cheat on his wife, I said coldly. Actions have consequences, Trevor. It's time your father learned that lesson. And what about me? Trevor asked, his voice breaking slightly. What about our relationship? If you go through with this, if you destroy Dad financially, you're destroying any chance we have of being a family again. The manipulation was so transparent, it would have been laughable if it wasn't so painful. We stopped being a family when you and your father conspired to steal from me, when you chose his happiness over basic decency toward your own mother. This isn't me destroying our relationship, Trevor. You and Walter did that all on your own. I can't believe you're being this vindictive, Trevor said, anger seeping back into his voice. Over what? Pride? Hurt feelings? You're going to ruin Dad's life because he fell in love with someone else? I'm going to enforce a legal agreement, I repeated. That's all. If that ruins your father's life, he has no one to blame but himself. I hung up before Trevor could respond, my hands shaking with adrenaline and emotion. Part of me had hoped, even after everything, that my son would understand, that he'd see how wrong his father's actions were, how hurtful his own betrayal had been. But Trevor had made his choice clear. He was his father's son in every sense of the word, willing to sacrifice integrity and family loyalty for money and convenience. Tomorrow, they would both learn that Dorothy Brennan wasn't the weak, easily dismissed woman they'd thought I was. Tomorrow, the game would truly begin. And I intended to win. I barely slept the night before the hearing. Not from anxiety or fear, but from the electric anticipation of what was about to unfold. I kept running through the evidence in my mind. The prenup, the love letters, the credit card statements, the documentation of Trevor's involvement in hiding assets. Walter thought he'd been so clever, so careful. He had no idea how thoroughly his arrogance had betrayed him. The morning of the hearing, I dressed with deliberate care. A charcoal gray suit that projected authority and dignity, pearl earrings that Walter had given me for our 20th anniversary, my wedding ring, which I'd continued wearing despite everything, because I wanted Walter to see it and remember what he'd thrown away. I looked in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back at me. 2 weeks ago, I'd been a frightened, heartbroken wife. Now, I was a warrior preparing for battle. Victoria had arranged to meet me at the courthouse at 9:30, giving us time to review our strategy before the 10 o'clock hearing. The Millbrook Falls County Courthouse was an imposing limestone building in the center of town, with marble columns and broad steps that made everyone who climbed them feel the weight of justice and law. I found Victoria waiting in the lobby, looking impeccable in a Navy power suit, her briefcase bulging with documentation. She smiled when she saw me, the kind of smile a general might give a trusted lieutenant before a decisive battle. "You look ready," she said approvingly. "How are you feeling?" "Surprisingly calm," I admitted. "Is that normal?" For someone who holds all the cards, absolutely. Victoria guided me to a quiet corner away from the other people milling about. "I want to go over what's going to happen in there. This is just a preliminary hearing, so it won't be dramatic like you see on TV. Judge Marilyn Kowalski will be presiding. She's fair, no nonsense, and she has zero tolerance for lawyers who try to play games with her." "And Lawrence Pemberton?" Victoria's smile turned sharp. "Lawrence is about to have the worst morning of his professional career. I spoke to his assistant yesterday to confirm he'd received our filing about the prenuptial agreement. From what I could gather, he still hasn't taken it seriously. He probably thinks it's some outdated document that won't hold up in modern court." "But it will?" "Dorothy, that prenup was written by one of the best family law attorneys in New York State circa 1978. Walter's mother didn't mess around. The language is airtight, and there's no statute of limitations on enforcing it. The only question is whether we can prove Walter committed adultery as defined in the agreement." "And we can?" Victoria patted her briefcase. "We have love letters in which your husband explicitly describes his affair. We have financial records showing him spending marital assets on his mistress. We have testimony from your son confirming that Walter told him about the relationship while still married to you. Unless Walter wants to claim he wrote dozens of love letters to Crystal as fiction, we have him dead to rights. At that moment, the elevator doors opened and Walter stepped out, flanked by Lawrence Pemberton and, to my shock, Trevor. My husband looked confident, almost relaxed, dressed in an expensive suit that I suddenly realized had probably been purchased with money he'd stolen from our joint accounts. Trevor avoided my eyes, staring at the floor like a guilty child. Lawrence Pemberton was exactly what I expected. A silver-haired man in his 60s wearing a suit that probably cost more than my car, carrying himself with the supreme confidence of someone who'd never lost a case he cared about. He spotted Victoria and his expression flickered with something between annoyance and condescension. "Victoria," he said with a nod as they approached. "I see you're representing Mrs. Brennan. I hope we can keep this civil and avoid any unnecessary drama." "I'm always civil, Lawrence," Victoria replied smoothly, "though I'm surprised you came to a preliminary hearing without fully reviewing the case files." Lawrence's smile didn't waver. "I've reviewed everything thoroughly. Your client has a copy of an old prenuptial agreement that she thinks entitles her to more than my client is generously offering. The key word being old. Family law has evolved significantly since 1978. Has the definition of adultery evolved?" Asked innocently. For the first time, Lawrence's confidence seemed to waver slightly. "I'm not sure what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything," Victoria said. "I'm stating clearly that your client engaged in an extramarital affair, which, according to the prenuptial agreement his mother insisted he sign, entitles my client to 75% of all marital assets." Walter had been standing silently, but now he spoke up, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Dorothy, this is ridiculous. You're really going to try to destroy me over a piece of paper from 45 years ago?" I looked at my husband, this man I'd loved and trusted for most of my adult life, and felt nothing but cold determination. "I'm going to enforce a legal agreement that you signed, Walter. An agreement that you clearly forgot about when you decided to throw away our marriage for a woman young enough to be your granddaughter." "She's not—" he started, then stopped himself, his face flushing red. "Not what? Not young enough to be your granddaughter? Walter, she's 32. You're 73. Do the math." "All parties for Brennan v. Brennan," a bailiff called out from the doorway. "Judge Kowalski is ready for you." We filed into the courtroom, a smaller hearing room rather than the grand courtroom I'd half expected. Judge Kowalski was already seated at the bench, a woman in her late 50s with sharp eyes and an expression that suggested she'd heard every excuse and lie in the book and believed none of them. "Counsel, please approach," she said without preamble. Victoria and Lawrence walked to the bench, and I could see them having a quiet conversation with the judge, papers being exchanged and examined. Judge Kowalski's eyebrows rose as she read through the documents Victoria had submitted. She looked up at Lawrence with something that might have been disappointment. "Mr. Pemberton, are you telling me you filed divorce proceedings without conducting a thorough search for pre-existing marital agreements?" Lawrence's confident demeanor cracked slightly. "Your Honor, the agreement in question is 45 years old. It wasn't in any of the standard databases, and my client didn't mention its existence." "Because your client forgot about it," Judge Kowalski said dryly, "which is not the same thing as it not existing." She turned to Victoria. "Miss Henderson, you've submitted the original prenuptial agreement, certified copies, and what appears to be substantial evidence of adultery?" "Yes, Your Honor. We have documented proof that Mr. Brennan engaged in an extramarital affair for at least 8 months prior to leaving his wife. This directly triggers the infidelity clause in the prenuptial agreement." Judge Kowalski looked at Lawrence. "I'm going to need to review all of this in detail, but prima facie, this appears to be a valid and enforceable agreement. Mr. Pemberton, I'm giving you 1 week to respond to these allegations with evidence. In the meantime, I'm issuing a temporary restraining order preventing Mr. Brennan from transferring, selling, or otherwise disposing of any marital assets until this matter is resolved." "Your Honor, that's highly irregular," Lawrence began. What's irregular is filing for divorce without doing your due diligence. Ms. Henderson has presented evidence suggesting possible asset concealment and fraud. Until I'm satisfied that all marital property is properly accounted for, nothing gets moved. Are we clear? Yes, Your Honor, Lawrence said through gritted teeth. Ms. Henderson, I want a complete accounting of all marital assets submitted within 3 days. Mr. Pemberton, you will have access to those documents and 1 week to respond. We'll reconvene 2 weeks from today for a full evidentiary hearing. Judge Kowalski gathered her papers. And Mr. Brennan? Walter, who'd been sitting at the defendant's table looking increasingly pale, stood up. Yes, Your Honor. I strongly suggest you start being honest with your attorney about the full scope of your financial situation. This case is going to be decided on facts and evidence, not on who can hire the more expensive lawyer. Dismissed. We filed out of the courtroom in tense silence. The moment we were in the hallway, Walter turned on me, his face flushed with fury. "You vindictive bitch," he hissed, keeping his voice low enough that the passing court staff couldn't hear. "You're really going to do this? You're really going to try to take everything I've built?" "Everything we built," I corrected calmly. "Or did you forget that I spent 45 years supporting your career while you built that practice? You supported my career by hosting dinner parties and playing housewife. I'm the one who went to dental school. I'm the one who worked 60-hour weeks building a patient base. I'm the one who took all the financial risks. With my parents' money as the initial investment. Or did you forget that detail too, that the down payment on your first office came from my inheritance?" Walter's mouth opened and closed, apparently having forgotten that particular fact. Lawrence Pemberton put a restraining hand on his client's arm. "Walter, don't say anything else," he warned. "Dorothy, this doesn't have to get ugly. Your husband made a mistake, but there's no reason to destroy his livelihood over it." "A mistake?" I looked at Lawrence with disbelief. "He had an 8-month affair. He lied to me repeatedly. He used our joint accounts to fund his relationship with his mistress. He conspired with our son to hide assets from me. Which part of that sounds like a simple mistake to you?" Trevor, who'd been standing silently behind his father, finally spoke up. "Mom, please, can't we talk about this privately as a family?" "We're not a family anymore, Trevor," I said, looking at my son and feeling my heart break all over again. "You made that clear when you chose to help your father steal from me." "I didn't steal anything," he protested. "I helped Dad organize his business affairs. There's nothing illegal about that. Except when it's done deliberately to hide assets in advance of a divorce, which, based on the evidence we have, is exactly what happened. Mrs. Brennan, we should go. We have a lot of work to do in the next 3 days." As Victoria led me away, I heard Walter say to Lawrence, "This is insane. There has to be a way to fight this. I'm not giving her 75% of everything I've worked for." "We'll discuss options back at my office," Lawrence replied, his voice grim. "But Walter, I have to be honest with you. If even half of what Victoria Henderson is claiming can be proven, you're in serious trouble." The next 72 hours were a blur of activity. Victoria had hired a forensic accountant, a sharp-eyed woman named Rebecca Chen, who specialized in finding hidden assets in divorce cases. Together, we went through every financial record I could access, building a comprehensive picture of Walter's wealth and, more damningly, his attempts to conceal it. What we found was even worse than I'd suspected. The patient transfers to Trevor's practice weren't the only scheme they'd cooked up. Walter had also moved several pieces of expensive dental equipment, collectively worth over $200,000, to a storage unit registered in Trevor's name. He'd transferred ownership of a rental property we owned in Ashford Heights to a shell company controlled by Trevor just 3 months ago, conveniently forgetting to mention it to me. He'd even opened new investment accounts in the Cayman Islands, funneling money out of our joint accounts in small increments that he probably thought I'd never notice. Rebecca worked her magic, tracing every transaction, documenting every transfer, building an ironclad case of deliberate fraud. By the time we submitted our accounting to the court, we had a 147-page document detailing not just the marital assets Walter had admitted to, but another $1.3 million in property and investments he'd tried to hide. This is beyond typical divorce asset concealment, Rebecca told Victoria and me during one of our marathon preparation sessions. This is systematic fraud. He's been planning this for at least 6 months, maybe longer. Every move was calculated to minimize what you'd be entitled to in the divorce. Can we prove Trevor was actively involved? I asked, part of me still hoping my son had been an unwitting accomplice rather than a full participant. Rebecca's expression was sympathetic but firm. Mrs. Brennan, I'm sorry, but yes, the paper trail shows your son opening accounts, signing transfer documents, even making deposits into the concealed investment accounts. This wasn't your husband acting alone. This was a coordinated effort between father and son to defraud you. The pain of that confirmation was worse than anything Walter had done. I could almost understand my husband's betrayal. People fall out of love. People make selfish choices. People convince themselves their happiness matters more than their obligations. But Trevor? My son? The child I'd raised to be honest and ethical, who I'd taught right from wrong, who I'd sacrificed so much for? His betrayal cut deeper than Walter's ever could. I want Trevor deposed, I told Victoria. I want him on the record, under oath, explaining his role in this. Victoria nodded. I've already filed the motion. His deposition is scheduled for next week, 2 days before the evidentiary hearing. That night, alone in the house that suddenly felt too big and too empty, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in Walter's study, the same room where I'd found his love letters to Crystal. I'd spent 45 years in this house, in this marriage, in this life that now felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. Who was Dorothy Brennan really? Not Walter's wife. That identity had been stripped away. Not Trevor's mother, at least in any meaningful sense anymore. Not the nurse I'd been before marriage. That career abandoned so long ago I could barely remember what it felt like to have professional purpose. I was a 70-year-old woman sitting alone in a house full of memories that had turned out to be lies. And yet, for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt something unexpected. Strength. My phone buzzed with a text message. Unknown number. I opened it hesitantly. Mrs. Brennan, this is Crystal Summers. We need to talk. Please call me. I stared at the message for a long moment, my heart rate accelerating. Walter's mistress wanted to talk to me? The audacity was breathtaking. I should delete it, block the number, tell Victoria about this inappropriate contact. Instead, I found myself dialing the number. She answered on the first ring. Mrs. Brennan? What do you want, Crystal? I kept my voice cool and controlled. I need you to know something about Walter and me, about all of this. She paused, and I could hear her taking a shaky breath. It's not what you think, or maybe it is, but there's more to it. Can we meet just for coffee, somewhere public? Please. There are things you need to know before the hearing. Every instinct told me this was a trap, a manipulation, some scheme Walter had cooked up to get to me outside of legal channels. But there was something in her voice, a genuine fear or desperation, that made me curious. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. at the Riverside Cafe downtown. You have 30 minutes of my time, and then I never want to hear from you again. Thank you, Crystal said, and she sounded close to tears. Thank you, Mrs. Brennan. I promise you won't regret this. I hung up and immediately called Victoria to tell her about the contact. Absolutely do not meet with her, Victoria said immediately. Dorothy, this could be witness tampering. It could jeopardize our entire case. But what if she wants to tell me something that helps our case? What if she's having second thoughts about Walter? Then she can tell it to me through proper legal channels, Victoria insisted. Please trust me on this. Meeting with your husband's mistress right before a major hearing is a terrible idea. But I'd already made my mind. I'll be careful. I won't discuss the case, but Victoria, I need to hear what she has to say. I need to look this woman in the eye and understand why my marriage ended." Victoria sighed heavily. "At least let me send an investigator to sit nearby and record the conversation, for your protection and for potential evidence." "Fine," I agreed, "but I'm doing this." The next morning, I arrived at Riverside Cafe 15 minutes early, claiming a corner table with a clear view of the entrance. Crystal arrived exactly at 10, and I have to admit, my first thought was how young she looked. Not just young in years, but young in demeanor. Uncertain, anxious, nothing like the confident homewrecker I'd built up in my mind. She was pretty in a conventional way, with long blonde hair and too much makeup, wearing a dress that seemed calculated to make her look sophisticated, but instead just emphasized her youth. She spotted me and walked over, her hands twisting nervously around her purse strap. "Mrs. Brennan, thank you for agreeing to meet me." "Sit," I said, not bothering with pleasantries. "You have 30 minutes. Start talking." Crystal sat down, ordering a coffee when the waitress appeared, but not touching it when it arrived. She stared at the cup for a long moment, gathering her courage before finally looking up at me. "I'm not who you think I am, or rather, I'm not who Walter told you I am. You're not a 32-year-old pharmaceutical sales representative who's been having an affair with my husband?" I asked, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "I am 32, Crystal said, "and I am a pharmaceutical rep, but the affair—" She swallowed hard. "Mrs. Brennan, I'm not Walter's mistress, I'm Trevor's." The world seemed to tilt sideways. I gripped the edge of the table, certain I'd misheard her. "What did you just say?" "I'm Trevor's girlfriend," Crystal repeated, tears starting to stream down her face. "We've been together for almost a year. Trevor found out about us 6 months ago, and he's been blackmailing both of us ever since." I couldn't speak, couldn't think, couldn't process what I was hearing. "Trevor is married?" I finally managed to say. "He has a wife, Karen." "They're separated, have been for 8 months. He moved out, filed for divorce, the whole thing. But he didn't tell you because he knew you'd be upset, and he was trying to wait for the right time." "And Walter found out about you?" Crystal nodded miserably. "He caught us together at Trevor's apartment. Trevor had told his dad we were having a business dinner, but Walter showed up unexpectedly and found us. He was furious, started screaming about how this would ruin Trevor's reputation, how a divorce and a young girlfriend would make him look like a joke in their professional community." "So he decided to pretend you were his mistress?" I was struggling to make sense of this. "He said if I played along, if I let people think I was with him instead of Trevor, he'd help smooth things over. He'd help Trevor with the divorce, make sure Karen didn't take him to the cleaners, protect Trevor's practice and reputation." Crystal wiped at her tears. "I didn't want to do it. It felt disgusting and wrong, but Trevor begged me. He said his dad was right, that if people knew he'd left his wife for someone so much younger, it would destroy his credibility." "And the affair? The 8 months of seeing each other?" "Lies. All lies. I've never been romantically involved with Walter. The dinners were real, but they were business meetings where he coached me on what to say and how to act if anyone asked. The gifts were props, things he bought to make the affair look real if anyone investigated." My mind was reeling, trying to reorganize everything I thought I knew. "But the love letters. I found dozens of love letters from Walter to you." Crystal looked confused. "Letters? Mrs. Brennan, I never received any letters from Walter. He barely tolerates me. He thinks I'm a gold digger trying to trap his son." I pulled out my phone, opening the photos I'd taken of the letters, and showed them to Crystal. Her eyes widened as she read them. "He wrote these?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Mrs. Brennan, I never saw any of these. This is insane." And suddenly, horribly, it all made sense. Walter hadn't forgotten about the Pre-Nup. He'd remembered it perfectly well. He'd created an entire fake affair, complete with love letters and financial records, to trigger the infidelity clause. But he'd planned to claim that I was the one having the affair, not him. The credit card charges at romantic restaurants? He probably went alone or with business associates, knowing the optics would look suspicious. The jewelry purchases? Props to plant as evidence of my supposed affair. The love letters signed with his name? He'd probably planned to claim I'd written them as forgeries to frame him. It was elaborate, calculated, and absolutely diabolical. Walter had tried to manufacture evidence of my infidelity to invoke the Pre-Nup against me, allowing him to take 75% of our assets instead of giving me an equitable share. But something had gone wrong with his plan. He'd gotten impatient or lazy, and instead of waiting to spring his trap, he'd simply walked out and filed for divorce, apparently forgetting that the Pre-Nup could be used against him if anyone discovered his actual affair with... Wait, I said slowly. If you're not his mistress, then who is Walter actually having an affair with? She bit her lip. I don't know for certain, but Trevor mentioned something about his dad spending a lot of time with someone named Diane, his office manager? Diane Fletcher. I knew her, a competent woman in her late 50s who'd been running Walter's practice for the past decade. A widow, professional, trustworthy. Or so I'd thought. Mrs. Brennan, Walter has been using me to cover up his real affair. He's been blackmailing Trevor into helping hide assets by threatening to expose his relationship with me in the worst possible light. And he's been planning to use the fake affair to take everything from you in the divorce. We're just all pawns in his game. I sat back in my chair, my mind racing through implications and possibilities. If what Crystal was saying was true, then Walter wasn't just an unfaithful husband. He was a calculating manipulator who'd been orchestrating an elaborate fraud against his own family.
Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Because I can't do it anymore, Crystal said, fresh tears streaming down her face. Trevor is a good man who made mistakes, but he doesn't deserve what his father is doing to him. And you... She looked at me with something like admiration. Trevor told me you hired Victoria Henderson. He told me about the Pre-Nup. Mrs. Brennan, Walter is terrified of you right now, and for the first time, I realized that maybe you could stop him. Maybe you could end this nightmare for all of us. I pulled out my phone and called Victoria, keeping my eyes on Crystal the whole time. Dorothy, Victoria answered. How's the meeting going? Victoria, I need you to get an emergency deposition scheduled for Crystal Summers. And I need you to start investigating someone named Diane Fletcher. She works as Walter's office manager. What's going on? Everything we thought we knew about this case was wrong, I said. Walter's not just hiding assets. He's been running a con against his entire family. And I think Crystal is ready to tell us everything. Crystal nodded vigorously, relief flooding her face. And Victoria, we're going to need to depose Diane Fletcher too, because I think we're about to discover Walter's real mistress. And when we do, this whole case is going to explode.